in your second year of your MFA, if it's like a 3-year program for me, it's kind of the time in which you start really having to like declare what your thesis project is going to be and what it is that you're hoping to leave the program with. And for fiction writers, the expectation is often that it's a novel, right? Or a collection of short stories. And I was working on a novel at the time, and I don't think it was, time, wasted for sure. But while I was working on that book, I just kept coming back to these other stories and these other poems that were just kind of coming out that were often very reactionary. And I really didn't feel like our program, and I don't know how this is in other MFA programs, but it often felt like our program, and it's my hope that this has changed, but at the time, they felt very segmented. It was fiction and poetry, and there wasn't a lot of crossover between the two. And so if you were both a fiction writer and a poet, it felt like there wasn't a whole lot of engagement with your work, right? They didn't know how to react to your work. And so I was just kind of writing a lot of these pieces on the side that were, very angry, and often, kind of, again, reacting to the violence. And, to be frank, a lot of the stories were also coming out of interactions that I had with classmates and with, some of the faculty that were, not so thinly veiled microaggressions, and I'm privileged enough to say that like those were the majority of my experiences were microaggressions, right? Like I've known people that left the program because they were much more than that. And it was kind of this systemic issues that I think we know is just an issue with academia writ large, right? It doesn't really matter what program you're in. We know that, these are institutions based entirely on white supremacy. And so trying to change the cultures of them, especially in the graduate level, is really challenging because you'd have to change the fundamental nature of the whole program. Anyway, I digress. But so a lot of the stories and pieces were kind of coming out of that. And at the end of my, time at the program, I ended up having, a full kind of, manuscript or chapbook. And so I ended up doing both part of my novel and this book as my thesis. And it was actually pretty cool. And I had some really great advisors and faculty who I, kind of had relationships with that were really supportive of that work and tried to find resources for me. So like if they knew that that wasn't really their area of expertise, they were trying to find resources for me to kind of help with some of the work that they may not be familiar with. So that was really helpful at the time.
Good. I'm glad you also had supporters and mentors that you connected with. And I appreciate you sharing this about your experience with the MFA program. I went through an MFA program myself and certainly took some wonderful things out of it, but also continue to reflect, especially in the work that Typewriter Tarot does and the attention that I try to pay to supporting creative people and helping creative people like stay connected to their creativity and do it from a place of joy rather than like paralyzing doubt and all of that. The more I realized that, MFA programs are so exalted, there's this belief that it is, the gateway to success as a writer. And as you mentioned, they like higher education institutions are part of the white supremacist system that exists in this country. And they're like another, I guess, like prop in capitalism as well to, maintain the labor force, to keep us in debt so that we need to keep working, all of these things. Yeah. And what I found too is that I didn't really learn a whole lot about my own creativity, about finding a creative process that works for me around like supporting myself as a creative individual. Obviously, like the attention to craft was very helpful. And I did learn so much there that I could like offer it and teach it to other people. But in terms of like a cultural or holistic kind of approach, as a program that is not present. And I went through the program and go through my whole life as a white woman. So most of my perception around like the disparities personally had to do with like the elevation of the men in the program against, not always explicitly against the women, but just generally at the expense of whatever. And most of them, of course, white men. And at the same time was aware that the women of color and the people of color in the program were having perhaps not only that experience, but one that was even worse around racial and ethnic identification. And so even though these are exalted spaces, even in especially in 2016, but at the advanced place we are in modernity, they are not beautiful bubbles of safety for everyone. So
no, yeah, absolutely.
That's my rant. I'm sure we could mutually rant for a long time, but I will keep us going.
Okay.
And yeah, anyway, I'm like, I just took a lot of time talking about that, but I couldn't help myself.
No, that's good. Well, and I guess I was just going to say too, that like that holistic piece that you were talking about, I completely agree with, because I think that, you know, I learned, I think I have never been more unhealthy, both in body and mind and spirit, than I was during those 3 years. And I think that was out of necessity, because I was being paid poverty wages, like so many of us. And, you know, I was with very little like financial support, right? You're getting loans and stuff like that. And I was, my labor was obviously like being exploited. And I was having to work multiple jobs that, you know, really were not. So yeah, I was just so incredibly burned out by the end of it, that my relationship to work, my relationship to creative work, it was so much of it at that time was the kind of this furious reaction to what I was experiencing, more so than a feeling of being taught how to cultivate, as you said, a writing life and a writing experience that would sustain me long term.
Yeah.
And I really feel like the years since then, I have had to unlearn a lot of that really negative, like kind of gritting your teeth and, you know, white knuckling through it. And I've had to learn new ways forward, because it is truly unsustainable to live that way. If you don't have, as you said, you know, especially for a lot of the white men in the program, and of course white women too, we're all complicit in that. But it's like, if you don't have someone apologizing for you constantly, which just seems like that was just the way it was a lot of the time, was just a lot of folks being given 1,000,001 chances to continue to do bad behavior and you know, not make spaces super accessible, accountable, or welcoming, then, you know, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
Just agreeing with you pretty much.
Yeah. And you touch on something as well. Like I didn't, you know, I think like a couple people in our program were given like really large fellowships that would sustain them primarily through the rest of the program. But the rest of us, and like no shade to those people. And I don't, you know, I'm not like faulting the allocation of the money, but the rest of us had a little bit of funding, and most of us were therefore needed to teach as graduate assistants, like teaching rhetoric and composition. So you had multiple classes of about 30 students, and these are writing classes where students were still very much beginning writers, and you were constantly, because it was a writing class, you were grading writing all the time, which is not the same as like grading a math test, right? Where there's like a right and a wrong answer. And so much time and energy went into learning how to teach, delivering the teaching and grading so that you could financially sustain yourself through the program, except you also did need student loans. And then at the end of it, it was like, I wasn't writing that much.